The English Jueju is a poem made of 4 lines. Each line includes 5 or 7 monosyllabic words. The lines follow a set thematic progression and end with an AA-BA rhyme scheme. However, there is much more to English Jueju than these simple rules indicate. A successful English Jueju must be both poetic and harmonious, and in this tradition, that means a poem must have li yi as well as wen dao. Li yi is a term used to describe a classical Chinese poem's core poetic meanings, its theme, tone, and overall feeling. Wen dao refers to the pattern of the poem following the patterns of heaven and earth, its harmony, rhythm and rhyme, parallelism of the meaning, as well as parallelism of the sound. The li yi, or theme of a poem, reveals how a poet sees the world, and, in return, we see his or her own inner nature. The Chinese imperial examination system believed poetry could not only reveal one's intelligence and sensitivity, but also one's originality and gracefulness. In short, classical Chinese poetry was a public mirror for one's own heart and mind.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Stalling, and for over 20 years I've been working on introducing a new form of poetry into the English language and into American culture. And that form is called the English Jueju. Jueju is a quatrain, a poem of 4 lines. In the beginning I called this Tong Quatrain, but then I realized I actually really want people to know the word Jueju, and not only to know what the word means, but how to write it. To learn about it from the outside is one thing, to learn how to do it yourself is another. So I hope that we will be able to spend some time together learning how to write the English Jueju. And Chinese poetry has been translated for a few hundred years. But before it was translated, Chinese poetry moved across the world in a different way. Instead of being translated into different languages, it transformed different languages. You see, in Vietnam, for instance, we can use the word Sino-Vietnamese to describe the way that Vietnamese poets would write poetry in Chinese, even though they don't speak Chinese. In Korea, we call this Sino-Korean. For 1,000 years, Korean poets wrote classical Chinese poetry following all those rules of classical Chinese poetry in Korean. In Japan, the same thing. Sino-Japanese poetry is Chinese poetry written in a Japanese language or mind. When they read those poems, they're thinking of those poems in their own language. But when you look at it on the page, it looks like Chinese, and it follows all of those rules. What we're going to be talking about today is how do we transform English into Sino-English. So what is Sino-English? Well, first and foremost, it is an English where we reduce all of the words to monosyllables. Monosyllables are those words with only one vowel, like cat and hat. Monosyllables are plentiful in the English language. We have well over 3,000 or 4,000 of them, and many of these come from the Anglo-Saxon, from very ancient words. And they're very easy to see, which is to say, they're very good words for poetry. And they're very similar to classical Chinese in almost every way. Classical Chinese, unlike modern Chinese, is also monosyllabic. Every Chinese poem is built with words of only one syllable. So if you want to build a classical Chinese poem, you have to get the meter right, and that meter is based on the monosyllable. So first and foremost, Sino-English is monosyllabic English. The other aspects of Sino-English are best understood in the context of the rules for classical Chinese poetry, and I'll be talking about those later. You see, translation is fine and it's really important, but classical Chinese poetry cannot easily be translated because its ideas actually are carried in the code. Not what the code represents, but the code itself. Those languages had to be transformed in order to be a conduit, in order to be a bridge for ideas of Chinese culture to spread. And why did they spread? Well, really, ideas of culture only spread when they're useful for the other people. So when you find something useful, you use it. And that's how an idea spreads. So in Vietnam, Korea, and Japan, classical Chinese poetry did something that was useful for those societies. So what was it? Well, classical Chinese poetry was first and foremost useful for the Chinese people. And before we get too far along, it's probably pretty important to note that China is a pretty diverse place. There are almost 50 minorities. These are non-Chinese ethnicities that speak different languages. But even if we look at the Han people, the Chinese ethnicity, they speak so many different accents and so many different dialects. A dialect in Chinese can be so different that we could say it's more different from Italian and Spanish or Portuguese. In many other contexts, we might call them languages. When it comes to accents, it's really hard to understand different accents of even the same dialect. So, when you think about China as an imagined space, a space where a Chinese person knows they're a part of a larger community, how was that created? How did human beings create the Chinese imaginary, the idea of Chineseness? And this is where poetry came in. Poetry was a tool that people used in order to understand how one Chinese person speaking one dialect in a very different world, the climate is different, the food is different, the local customs are different. How is this person Chinese at the same time as someone else? And how does a nation with so many diverse peoples remain a nation at all? Why don't they break into civil war and separate into different kingdoms? And so for 2,000 years, one of the ways in which the Chinese Empire remained intact was through a testing regime, something called the imperial examination system. And at the core of that imperial exam was poetry. How to compose a poem was one of the primary skills that would have bought you entrance into higher political authority and responsibility. That's right, a poetry exam to be a ruler. So important was this exam that people would let's say you have 5 children. 4 children, if you were in a wealthy family, might have to work in the field to produce enough food to pay for that one child not to work in the field. So they need to create enough calories for the whole family to eat, -1. And that could be quite difficult for a family without means. Now imagine you are that child studying for this poetry exam. That is not studying like we study. Imagine all of your siblings working in the field so that you and only you could study. So you study deeply and hard and long. Now let's imagine you are not a poor middle-class style family, but instead a ruling family. And you want, because you're an ambitious person and your family wants power, you must also succeed through the examination system. So you have a lot of responsibility. And that responsibility is to learn the rules so well that you become graceful, creative, original, never looking stifled by the rules. You want to be so good, you want to understand this material so well that it's completely natural. So let's imagine that one of these princelings from a kingdom in southern China or in northern China passes the exam. Great, congratulations. Now what? Those would be brought into the central government and they would likely be removed from their home and put somewhere else in the kingdom. What does that do? It means they're no longer at their home base. They can no longer raise an army there. Instead, they're somewhere else, fulfilling their aspirations to be an important person in the empire. This will keep power displaced, moving, as it were, kind of decapitating, as it were, the most ambitious, bright minds and moving them, from their family structures and moving them around the empire. And so you can start to see that poetry would be the perfect exam, because if you can write a beautiful poem, you would demonstrate that you believe in this thing called China. And what is this thing? And what does the poem show? As we'll be talking about through this lecture today, that a poem reveals one's ability to understand how the world works according to the classical Chinese worldview. That is, that the world is, and that people's role in the world are a bit different from one another. Here's an example. You could say that clouds have a certain kind of pattern that makes them a cloud, and a rock has a rock pattern that makes them a rock. But a human's pattern is a little hard to understand because you could look at a person and not know what kind of person they are. So in the classical Chinese worldview is that a person must cultivate their personness. They must, in a certain sense, learn to be a human being. And that you learn that by cultivating yourself, by drawing upon the wisdom of the ancients. And what did the ancients teach those classical Chinese people? It taught them that the world sometimes fell out of balance, and that's why we have sickness. Or sometimes a ruler may treat people unequally, and that will create chaos and conflict. So instead, rulers, as well as families, or from the local government to the national government scale, should always follow the notion of balance and harmony. But in order to do that, that should come naturally from you, not as a rule at all. That should be your very nature. To do that, it means you must demonstrate gracefulness and naturalness in your balance and harmony. But poetry was a more equal space. People of different places would be able to bring language into balance. And for the classical Chinese worldview, that means balancing the meaning of a poem and also balancing the sound of a poem. And to understand this, we will be introducing concepts like yin and yang, and we will think about things like the 5 elements, and how a poetry exam or how a poetic form could reveal that you have been cultivated to the level you need in order to take on greater responsibility. So you could say that from one perspective, classical Chinese poetry is just about becoming human in a deeper, more meaningful way. And that's why, personally, I find teaching and writing in this form so wonderful and something I've enjoyed doing for over 20 years. But from another perspective, it could help us gain insight into how the Chinese historical narrative works, how and why China looks the way it does. It gives us a window into deep Chinese culture and helps us understand even politics better. So I hope you'll join me as we go a little bit further into these concepts of Li Yi and Wen Dao. Li Yi being what makes a poem poetic in Chinese, and Wen Dao, how do we bring our language and ourselves into harmony with the Tao, with the path, with nature itself. Poetry will give us both, the beauty of poetry and the pattern and harmony of nature.